The whole town of Laramie, Wyoming had gathered like they were watching some kind of show. Boots crushed the muddy ground. Horses snorted in the cold air. Men leaned against wagons while women whispered behind gloved hands. And in the middle of it all stood a young woman with a rough sack pulled over her head. Her wrists were tied with rope. The rope ran through an iron ring bolted into the side of an old wagon that had been turned sideways to serve as an auction block. They said she was cursed. They said every man who looked at her face met ruin. They said her own father had begged the town to take her away before she destroyed the rest of them. Some folks laughed when they said it. Others crossed themselves like they believed it. But the girl did not move. Even with the sack covering her head, she stood straight. Her shoulders were steady. Her chin lifted beneath the cloth as if she refused to bow to the crowd around her. A thin man named Clyde Mercer stood on the wagon waving a folded paper in the air. "Strong back," Clyde called loudly. Young, healthy, no sickness, just unfortunate in the face. The crowd chuckled. $10, Clyde shouted. $10 and she's yours. You don't even have to look at her. Keep the sack on if it bothers you. A drunk ranch hand stumbled forward. $5, he slurred. Another man laughed. "I'll give $7. Need someone to scrub floors." They talked about her like she wasn't even there, like she was a broken mule, like she was a sack of grain. At the of the crowd stood a tall man wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat dusted with snow. Elias Boone had ridden down from the Bighorn Mountains that morning. He came to Laramie only a few times each year to trade furs and buy supplies before winter sealed the high passes. He had not come looking for a bride, but now he stood there watching something that made his chest tighten in a way he did not like. He had seen men die in the war. He had seen starving families and broken towns. But this felt worse, because the woman on that wagon was still alive, and the town was treating her like she wasn't. $7, the ranch hand repeated. Clyde Mercer grinned. 7 going once. 20. The voice cut through the noise like a rifle shot. The crowd turned. Elias stepped forward slowly. Snow clung to his boots. His broad shoulders filled the space between two wagons as people moved aside. Clyde's mouth fell open. 20. "Boone?" he said. "You ain't even seen her." Elias's voice was low and steady. "I'm buying her work, not her face." The girl's hands tightened slightly at her sides when he spoke. Someone in the crowd scoffed. "You'll regret it when you see her." Elias didn't look away from the wagon. 30. Now the crowd went silent. No one wanted to spend that much money on someone they believed was cursed. Clyde Mercer wasted no time. He snatched the leather pouch Elias tossed onto the wagon. The coins inside clinked heavy. "Sold," he shouted. "She's yours, mountain man." He leaned closer to Elias with a crooked grin. "Don't come crying when you see what's under that sack." Elias climbed onto the wagon. Up close, the girl seemed smaller than he expected, but there was something about the way she stood that felt strong. He untied the rope from the iron ring. For a moment, he considered pulling the sack off right there in front of everyone, but he didn't. "Walk," he said quietly. She stepped down beside him. The crowd watched them leave, whispering and laughing behind their backs. Elias ignored them. Outside town, he mounted his chestnut stallion and tied the lead rope of a second horse to his saddle. He helped the girl climb onto the spare horse. Her movements were careful, balanced, not clumsy, not afraid. They rode out of Loran beneath a gray sky. Snow covered the ground as they climbed toward the mountains. For hours they rode in silence. The town disappeared behind them like a bad memory. Finally, Elias spoke. "You can take it off." The girl did not answer. "No one's watching," he added. After a moment, she reached up and loosened the rope around the sack. But instead of removing it completely, she only lifted the cloth enough to see the trail ahead. Her face remained hidden. Elias frowned slightly but said nothing. By nightfall, they reached his cabin. It stood beside a frozen creek surrounded by tall pine trees. Smoke drifted from the chimney. The place was rough but solid, built by Elias with his own hands. He dismounted and helped her down. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled in the stone hearth. The warm scent of pine filled the room. Elias closed the door behind them. "Take it off," he said. The girl stood in the center of the room. Firelight flickered across the burlap sack covering her head. For a long moment, she didn't move. "I won't scream," Elias said calmly. "And I won't send you back." Her hands rose slowly. They trembled just a little. Then she pulled the sack upward and lifted it away. Elias expected burns. He expected twisted skin or some terrible disfigurement. Instead, he gasped. She was beautiful, not in the soft way of city ladies. Her features were sharp and strong. Long dark hair fell to her shoulders. Her skin looked pale against the firelight, but it was her eyes that held him still. One eye was bright green, the other was gray like a storm cloud, and across her cheek ran a thin scar. It looked deliberate, like someone had cut her on purpose. She watched him carefully, waiting, watching for disgust. "Well," she said quietly, "do I look cursed?" Elias stepped closer. He studied the scar. The clean line of it told him something important. That was no accident. "Who did that?" he asked. "My husband." The word hung heavy in the air. "I ran," she continued. "He caught me. Said no man would ever want me again." Her voice stayed steady. "So he made sure of it." Elias felt heat rise inside his chest. Not fear, not pity, rage. "What's his name?" "Caleb Turner." Elias knew it immediately. Turner owned half the cattle in the valley below Laramie. Rich, powerful, the kind of man who believed the law belonged to him. "He won't come up here," Elias said. The girl shook her head. "He will." She met his eyes. "He doesn't let things go." Elias studied her again. "What's your name?" "Rebecca Hale." He nodded once. "You can take the loft upstairs. I'll sleep down here." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "You're not afraid?" she asked. "I've seen worse than scars." Elias said, "And I don't believe in curses." The next few days passed quietly. Rebecca worked without being asked. She cleaned the cabin. She cooked meals better than Elias had eaten in years. She even mended his torn coat with careful stitches. One afternoon, Elias came in from checking traps and found her sitting by the window, reading an old Bible from the shelf. "You can read me?" he asked. Rebecca looked up. "My father was a school teacher." Elias sat across from her. "Why did you marry Turner?" Her hands tightened slightly around the book. "I didn't have a choice." Snow began falling harder that week. The mountains grew silent beneath deep winter. On the 6th night, Elias stepped outside to bring in firewood. Then he stopped. Tracks. Fresh horse tracks in the snow. 3 of them. They circled the cabin, then disappeared back down the trail. Elias' stomach turned cold. He walked inside slowly. Rebecca looked up from the table. "What is it?" "Pack what you need," Elias said. Fear flashed across her mismatched eyes. "He found us." Elias grabbed his rifle from above the door. "Not yet," he said, "but he's close." Outside, a branch snapped. Then came the crunch of hooves in the snow. A voice called from the dark. "Rebecca!" Her face went pale. Caleb Turner's voice slid through the trees like a snake. "Come home," he shouted. "You don't belong with that animal." Elias stepped in front of her. "You stay behind me." The cabin door rattled as someone slammed against it. "Open up, Boone," Caleb shouted, "or we burn you out." Rebecca's breathing quickened. Elias looked at her. "You know how to shoot?" She nodded once. He handed her a spare rifle. Outside, boots crunched closer through the snow. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked softly. Then the first gunshot shattered the window. Wood splintered across the room. Cold wind rushed inside. Elias fired back through the door. A man screamed outside. Rebecca moved quickly to the side wall and aimed through the broken window. Another shot rang out, more shouting. Caleb's voice roared with anger. "You think you can keep what's mine?" Rebecca's eyes hardened. "I was never yours," she whispered. Elias glanced at her and saw something fierce burning in her expression. Not fear, strength. The cabin door groaned under another heavy blow. Elias reloaded his rifle. "They'll try the back," he said. Rebecca ran to the rear window and steadied her aim. Outside, the latch began to move slowly. Without hesitation, she fired through the wood. A body dropped in the snow. For a moment, everything went quiet. Snow swallowed the sound of the world. Then, Caleb shouted from the trees, "This isn't over." Elias stepped to the broken window. Through the swirling snow, he saw a rider retreating down the trail. Caleb Turner, alive. But the look he gave the cabin before disappearing into the storm promised something far worse than tonight. Elias shut the door and barred it tight. Rebecca stood shaking now. the rifle still clutched in her hands. He gently lowered the gun. "You did good," he said. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks. "He won't stop." Ilias looked out into the dark storm beyond the cabin. "Then neither will we." Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, and winter had only just begun. The storm did not stop for 3 days. Snow buried the cabin halfway to the windows. Wind roared through the pine trees and piled white drifts against the walls. The mountains disappeared behind a thick curtain of blowing snow. Inside the cabin, the fire burned day and night. Rebecca worked quietly. She chopped vegetables. She stirred soup over the fire. She cleaned the rifles and laid them in a neat row on the table. Neither of them spoke much. They both knew Caleb Turner was still out there somewhere, and men like him did not give up easily. On the second night, Elias woke to a sound above him, soft crying. He sat up slowly on his cot near the door. The cabin was dim except for the glowing fire. "Rebecca?" he said gently. The crying stopped. After a moment, the ladder creaked and she climbed down from the loft. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders. The scar along her cheek caught the firelight. "I had a dream," she said quietly. Elias added another log to the fire. "What kind of dream?" "He found me again," she whispered. Only this time there was no one to help. Elias leaned back against the wall. "He's flesh and blood," Elias said calmly. "Not some ghost." Rebecca looked at him. "And flesh and blood can bleed." She studied him for a moment. "You talk like a soldier." "I was," Elias answered. "Cavalry." Rebecca sat near the fire. "What did you learn in the war?" Elias stared into the flames. "That fear is loud before a fight." He paused. "But after the first shot, it goes quiet. Then it's just action." Rebecca nodded slowly. "You're not afraid of him," she said. Elias shrugged. "I don't like bullies." The storm finally cleared on the fourth morning. The sky turned bright and cold. Sunlight reflected off endless snow across the mountains. Elias stepped outside to check the area around the cabin. He walked slowly through the drifts. Then he crouched down. More tracks. Not 3 this time. 5. They had come back during the storm. Watch the cabin again. Elias followed the tracks for a short distance before they disappeared down the mountain trail. His jaw tightened. Inside the cabin, Rebecca looked up as he entered. "How many?" 5. She set down the cup she was washing. "He won't stop until I'm back in chains." Elias looked around the cabin. "They won't attack during the day," he said. "They'll wait for dark." Rebecca stood straighter. "Then we don't wait?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We take the fight to him." The words hung between them. Elias studied her face. "You want revenge?" Rebecca shook her head slowly. "I want freedom." She walked to the window and stared down the mountain. "Caleb's ranch sits in the lower valley," she continued. "There's a supply barn near the edge of the property." She turned back toward Elias. "If that burns, he loses his winter feed." Elias crossed his arms. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about it every night," she said. Silence filled the cabin. Then Elias nodded once. That afternoon, they saddled the horses. The ride down the mountain felt different this time. Rebecca did not sit quietly behind Elias. She rode beside him. Her rifle rested across her back. They reached the valley near dusk. Caleb Turner's ranch stretched wide across frozen fields. The main house stood tall and painted white. Smoke rose from its chimney. But the supply barn stood separate from the rest, large, full of hay. Elias tied his horse among the trees. "You sure about this?" he asked. Rebecca nodded. There was never going back. They moved through the snow carefully. The ranch hands were inside the house, keeping warm. No one watched the barn. Rebecca slipped inside first. The smell of hay filled the air. Stacks of feed rose high to the rafters. Barrels lined the walls. Rebecca pulled a small lantern from her coat. Her hands shook slightly as she struck a match. Elias placed his hand gently over hers. "No going back after this," he said. Rebecca met his eyes. "There never was." She lit the lantern and tipped it into a pile of dry hay. At first the flames were small, then they spread. Hay crackled and caught fire quickly. Smoke began filling the barn. Elias and Rebecca slipped back outside and hurried into the trees. Within minutes, flames burst through the wooden walls. Men shouted from the ranch house. Buckets of water were thrown uselessly as the fire grew larger. Caleb Turner stormed out of the house pulling on his coat. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see the rage twisting his face. He stared at the burning barn. Then he turned slowly toward the dark tree line. Rebecca felt a strange calm settle inside her chest. "He knows," she whispered. "Yes," Elias said quietly. "And now he's angry." Rebecca watched the flames climb higher. "Good." They rode back into the mountains beneath a sky full of stars. For 2 days, nothing happened. The valley remained quiet. But on the third night, the attack came. It started with fire. A flaming torch slammed into the roof of the stable. Elias was outside chopping wood when he saw it. He ran to the well shouting, "Rebecca!" She burst from the cabin with a bucket. More torches flew from the darkness. 5 riders circled the cabin. Caleb Turner's voice rose above the chaos. "You think you can burn my land?" His horse moved through the snow toward the cabin. "I'll burn your whole world down." Elias fired his rifle. One rider's horse screamed and bolted into the trees. Rebecca splashed water across the stable roof before flames could spread. Gunfire exploded from every direction. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls. Elias grabbed Rebecca's arm. "Inside!" "Hakrum!" They ran through the door as shots cracked around them. Elias slammed the door shut and barred it. "They'll rush the cabin soon," he said. Rebecca loaded cartridges with quick, steady hands. "You could leave me," she said suddenly, "if he only wants me." Elias turned sharply. "I don't leave people behind." The door shook under a heavy blow. A ranch hand burst through the entrance. Rebecca fired instantly. The man collapsed to the floor. Another rushed in. Elias shot him through the chest. Outside, Caleb shouted with fury. Smoke drifted through the broken doorway. Then Caleb himself stepped forward. Elias saw him clearly through the haze. Tall, angry, rifle raised. 2 shots rang out at the same moment. Elias felt a burning pain slice across his side. He staggered but stayed on his feet. Caleb's shoulder exploded with blood. His rifle dropped into the snow. Their eyes locked through the shattered doorway. Caleb snarled like a wounded wolf. "This ends tonight," he growled. He reached for his pistol. Rebecca stepped beside Elias. Her rifle lifted slowly. Her voice was calm. "You already ended it." She pulled the trigger. Caleb Turner fell backward into the snow. For a moment, everything went silent. The remaining riders fled into the trees. Elias leaned heavily against the wall, breathing hard. Rebecca walked slowly outside. Snow drifted down around Caleb's body. She stared at the man who had hunted her, the man who had scarred her, the man who tried to own her. Now he lay still, no shouting, no chains. Elias stepped beside her. "It's done," he said quietly. Rebecca looked up at the dark sky. For the first time since leaving Laram, her shoulders relaxed. The mountains stood silent around them. The cold air felt clean again. They dragged the bodies away from the cabin and covered them with snow. There would be questions one day, but for now the valley was quiet. That night, Rebecca did not cry in her sleep. Before dawn, she climbed down from the loft and sat beside Elias near the fire. "Thank you," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "You saved yourself." Rebecca touched the scar on her cheek. "I thought this mark meant I was ruined." Elias looked at her. "It means you survived." The fire crackled gently between them. Outside, the first light of morning touched the snowy peaks. Winter was still strong, but the fear that had followed Rebecca from Laramie was finally gone. Or at least that was what they believed. The valley stayed quiet for a week after Caleb Turner fell in the snow. No riders came up the mountain. No torches burned in the night. The only sounds were wind moving through the tall pine trees and the slow cracking of ice along the frozen creek. But Elias Boone knew the West well enough to understand something important. Silence did not always mean peace. Sometimes it meant trouble was still deciding when to arrive. On the 8th morning, Elias saddled his horse and rode down the mountain trail toward the small trading post near the fork in the river. The cabin had enough meat from his traps, but flour and salt were running low. Rebecca insisted on coming. "You don't have to ride everywhere with me," Elias said as he tightened the saddle strap. Rebecca swung onto her horse beside him. "Yes, I do," she replied calmly. "We face things together now." Elias did not argue. The ride down the mountain was quiet. Spring had not yet reached the high country, but the sun felt warmer on their backs. The snow had begun to soften along the trail. When they reached the trading post, the old wooden sign above the door creaked in the wind. Two unfamiliar horses stood tied outside. Elias noticed them immediately. Inside the small building, three men stood near the counter speaking in low voices. They wore long dusters and clean boots, not miners, not ranch hands, lawmen. One of them turned when the door opened. "You Elias Boone?" the tallest one asked. Elias stepped inside slowly. "That depends who's asking." The man removed his hat. "Deputy Marshal Warren Cole." His eyes shifted toward Rebecca. "We're here about Caleb Turner." Rebecca's back stiffened. Elias kept his voice calm. "What about him?" Cole studied both of them carefully. "He was found dead," he said. "Shot." The words hung in the room. Cole continued. "Witnesses say you and this woman were seen riding near his property the night his barn burned." Elias leaned against the counter. "Witnesses say a lot of things." Cole's eyes moved to the scar on Rebecca's cheek. "You Rebecca Hale?" "Yes." "Caleb Turner was your husband." Rebecca did not look away. "He forced that marriage." Cole crossed his arms. "Maybe so. But powerful men tend to have powerful friends." The air inside the trading post felt tight. "You planning to arrest her?" Elias asked. Cole sighed slowly. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether she killed him in self-defense." Rebecca stepped forward. "He broke into our cabin with 5 armed men," she said clearly. "He fired first. I shot back." Cole watched her face for a long moment. "You got proof?" Elias met his eyes. "You're welcome to ride up and see the bullet holes in my walls." Cole glanced toward his 2 deputies. One of them shrugged slightly. "Turner had enemies," the deputy muttered. "Plenty of them." Cole rubbed his jaw. "Thing is," he said slowly, "when a man like Turner dies, folks start looking for someone to blame." Rebecca felt a chill run through her. "He has a brother," Cole continued. "Runs cattle south of Cheyenne." Clears throat. Elias frowned. "And he's offering $500 for the woman who killed Caleb." The room went silent. $500 was a fortune in the mountains. Enough money to make dangerous men start hunting. Elias's hand rested near his belt. Cole noticed and raised both palms. "I ain't here to collect it," he said. "But bounty hunters might be." Rebecca's eyes hardened. "So what are you saying?" Cole placed his hat back on his head. "I'm saying if you two stay up on that mountain, you better be ready." Elias nodded once. "We've been ready." Cole stepped aside to let them pass. "I never liked Turner," he admitted quietly, "but the law doesn't care about feelings." The ride back to the cabin felt heavier than before. Rebecca stared at the rising mountains ahead of them. "It never ends," she said quietly. Elias shook his head. "It just changes." 3 weeks passed. Snow slowly melted beneath the early spring sun. The frozen creek cracked and began flowing again. For a while it seemed like the trouble had passed. Then one afternoon, Rebecca heard a distant gunshot echo through the mountains. Elias had gone to check traps near the ridge. Rebecca grabbed her rifle and ran outside. Another shot echoed through the trees. Without thinking, she mounted her horse and rode toward the sound. Smoke drifted faintly near the edge of the forest. When she reached the clearing, her heart nearly stopped. Elias knelt behind a fallen log. Blood soaked through his pant leg. Across the clearing, 2 men crouched behind trees holding rifles. Bounty hunters. Elias fired again, and one of the men screamed as the bullet struck his shoulder. The second hunter ducked behind a tree. Rebecca slid off her horse and dropped behind a rock. "You all right?" she shouted. "Still breathing." Elias called back through clenched teeth. The bounty hunter behind the tree laughed. $500 says she's worth more dead than alive." Rebecca's grip tightened around her rifle. She moved quietly through the brush, circling wide. The hunter kept his eyes locked on Elias. He never saw Rebecca coming. She stepped up behind him. "Turn around," she said coldly. The man spun halfway before she slammed the rifle stock across his head. He collapsed into the snow. The wounded hunter fled into the trees, dragging his injured arm behind him. Rebecca ran to Elias. Blood flowed from a deep wound in his thigh. She tore fabric from the bottom of her skirt and pressed it tightly against the wound. "You came alone," Elias muttered. "You would have done the same," she said. Getting him back to the cabin took most of the afternoon. For 2 days, Rebecca barely slept. She boiled water. She cleaned the wound. She fed him broth and kept the fire burning through the cold nights. On the second night, rain tapped gently against the roof. Elias lay on his cot, staring up at the wooden beams. "You could leave," he said quietly. Rebecca looked up from the chair beside him. "Leave? Ride east," he said. "Take money from Turner's estate. Start fresh somewhere." Rebecca shook her head slowly. "I don't want fresh." She leaned closer. "I want this." Elias studied her face. The scar no longer looked like damage. It looked like strength. "You sure?" he asked. Rebecca smiled faintly. "They tried to sell me with a sack over my head," she said. "You were the only one who saw me standing straight." She placed her hand over his. "I'm not running anymore." Weeks passed. Spring melted the last snow from the mountains. No more bounty hunters came. Word spread quietly that Caleb Turner's death had been ruled self-defense. His brother lost interest once the ranch began falling apart without Caleb running it. One evening in late May, Rebecca stood outside the cabin, watching wildflowers bloom beside the creek. Elias joined her, walking slowly but stronger each day. "You ever regret it?" Rebecca asked. "I'm buying you?" He said with a small smile. "Yes." Elias looked toward the mountains glowing gold in the setting sun. "I thought I was buying help for winter," he said. Rebecca laughed softly. "Turns out you bought trouble." Elias nodded. "Best trouble I ever had." She stepped closer to him. "You know something," she said gently. "You never asked me to marry you." Elias blinked. "I figured you'd had enough of that word." Rebecca shook her head. "With the right man, it means," clears throat, "something different." Elias took her hands in his rough ones. "No preacher up here," he said. Rebecca looked around at the tall pine trees in the shining creek. "We don't need one." Under the wide sky of the Bighorn Mountains, they made a quiet promise. No chains, no fear, no ownership, only choice. Summer arrived bright and warm. The cabin stood strong against storms. The valley slowly healed. The ranch that once belonged to Caleb Turner was sold piece by piece. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the town council in Laramie. Rebecca read it slowly. The town had officially cleared her name. They admitted Caleb Turner had lied about her. When she finished reading, she walked to the fire and dropped the letter into the flames. "I don't need their approval," she said. Elias nodded. "You never did." Years later, travelers passing through the mountains would sometimes speak about a tall mountain man and a sharp-eyed woman who lived near a frozen creek. They said she had one green eye and one gray. They said she could shoot straighter than most men. And they said the mountain man listened every time she spoke. Some travelers claimed they once saw her ride through Laramie again. No sack, no shame, her scar shining openly in the sunlight. No one dared call her cursed anymore. Elias Boone had once bought a rejected bride with a sack on her head. He thought he was rescuing a broken woman, but the truth turned out very different. She had never been broken, and in the end, it was not the mountains that made Elias Boone strong. It was her.